She came west with nothing but a carpetbag and a desperate hope. She trusted a stranger's letters because she had run out of better options. And the moment she stepped off that stagecoach in the Nevada snow, a man's fist connected with her jaw, and she was told she was property now. She belonged to someone. She had no choice. But then she fell, and someone caught her. A quiet rancher with dark hair and haunted eyes and a secret so heavy it had bent him nearly double for 16 years. He did not have to catch her. He did not have to bring her inside and tend her wounds and stand between her and the most powerful man in the county. He had every reason in the world to look away. He did not look away. What happens when a broken woman falls into the arms of a broken man, and together they turn out to be exactly strong enough to save each other? Stay with me, because this is a story about what courage really looks like when everything has been taken from you and you choose to stand up anyway. This channel is dedicated to the stories of the American West, tales of cowboy honor and frontier love, of mothers who sacrificed everything, of strangers who became family, and of the profound human capacity for compassion even in the hardest of circumstances. These are the stories that remind us who we are at our best. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this story. Desperation is not weakness. Reaching out when you have nothing left is not failure. Sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is trust one more time after they have been broken. Clara Whitfield did not find love because she was lucky. She found it because she refused to let what had been done to her define what she was capable of doing next. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something true about the human heart, I hope you will like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you longest. And if you believe that stories like this one matter, please subscribe to this channel, because there are many more waiting for you here, and every single one of them was written for exactly this moment, when you needed to remember that goodness is real.
I hit the frozen ground before I knew I was falling. The last thing I remembered clearly was the relay station outside Redemption Creek, Nevada, and the smell of whiskey on Curtis Graves's breath as he leaned into the stagecoach door. The last thing I felt before the cold rushed up to meet me was his fist connecting with the side of my jaw, and the particular sound a person makes when they have decided that another human being is something less than that. Then there was snow. And then there were hands, large hands, steady hands, catching me before I hit the frozen ground like I was something worth the effort of catching. I had not felt like something worth saving in a very long time. My name is Clara May Whitfield. I was 24 years old on the January morning I fell out of a stagecoach in Nevada, and I had come west with everything I owned packed into a single carpet bag and a heart full of the particular desperation that comes from having no better options. Let me tell you how I arrived at that relay station. Let me tell you what brought a seamstress from Columbus, Ohio to the frozen edge of the Nevada high desert in the worst January storm in a decade. My parents died on the same Tuesday in September of 1877. Typhoid fever, the doctor said, as if naming the thing made it smaller. Within a week, I had buried them both in the churchyard behind the Methodist church where they had been married 26 years before. Within a month, the bank had sent a man with papers explaining that the mortgage my father had taken out during the bad summer of 1874 was now in default, and that I had 30 days to vacate the property. I moved into a boarding house on Clement Street. I sewed 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, making shirts for a factory on the east side of Columbus that paid me 14 cents per shirt, and considered this arrangement generous. I ate one proper meal a day and told myself I was managing. I was not managing. I was surviving, which is a different thing entirely and a lesser one. The letter from Edmund Graves arrived through the Westward Hearts Matrimonial Agency in November, 6 weeks after my parents died. It was 3 pages long, written in a neat, controlled hand. Edmund Graves described himself as a widower of 50, owner of a prosperous cattle ranch outside Redemption Creek, Nevada. He described the wide Nevada sky and the clean mountain air and the life that a capable woman could build in the West if she had the courage to come for it. He said he needed a wife who was not afraid of hard work. He said he would provide a home and security and respectful partnership in exchange for companionship and the management of his household. I read that letter 4 times. I was not naive. I knew that mail-order arrangements were not love stories. But I also knew that love stories were not keeping me fed on Clement Street and that 14 cents per shirt was not going to rebuild anything resembling a life, I wrote back. We exchanged 6 letters over 8 weeks. His were always measured, always pleasant, always just specific enough to seem genuine and just vague enough that I could not later identify a specific lie. I understand that now. I did not understand it then. I sold everything I had that was worth selling, bought a stage ticket to Redemption Creek, Nevada, and boarded a westbound coach on January 3rd, 1878, with my carpetbag and my mother's sewing kit, and what I now recognize as the particular blindness of a person who has run out of alternatives. The journey took 11 days. On the 12th day, the coach stopped at the last relay station before Redemption Creek to change horses. Curtis Graves was waiting. He was younger than Edmund, maybe 38, with the same controlled features gone slack from drink and the particular mean quality in his eyes of a man who has never once been told no by anyone in a position to enforce it. He looked me over the way a man looks at livestock he has purchased, and found disappointing. He said Edmund had sent him to collect his property early. I told him I was not anyone's property. That was when he hit me. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named George Pratt, pulled Curtis off me and loaded me back into the coach and pushed the horses hard toward Redemption Creek through a worsening storm. I sat in the corner of the coach with my hand pressed against my jaw and told myself I was not going to cry, and mostly succeeded. The storm caught us 2 miles outside of town. The wheel hit an ice rut on a downhill bend, and the coach lurched sideways and the door swung open and I went with it out into the frozen Nevada air, falling toward ground I could not see through the dark and the snow. And then the hands. I felt myself caught, lifted, pressed against something solid and warm that smelled of pine smoke and leather and cold air. I heard a voice say something low that I could not quite make out. I felt myself lifted onto a horse, and a hand pressed steady against my back to keep me upright, and the horse began to move. I tried to see the face of the person who had caught me. The lantern light was poor and the snow was heavy and my vision was narrowing at the edges in a way that told me I was about to lose consciousness. What I saw was this: a tall man with dark hair and a jaw set hard against the weather, and eyes that were looking at me with an expression I could not immediately name. Not pity, not calculation, something more careful than either of those. He said loudly enough to carry over the wind, "You're safe, I've got you." I had heard plenty of men say plenty of things they did not mean. Something in the specific flatness of his voice, the way he said it like a statement of fact rather than a comfort, made me think this one might be different. I held onto the saddle horn with both hands and tried not to pass out in a stranger's arms. I failed at that, but only just. Charge. I woke in a bed, a real bed with a feather mattress and wool quilts stacked 3 deep and a fire burning in a small cast-iron stove in the corner of the room. The ceiling above me was rough-hewn pine boards fitted carefully together. Someone had built this room with attention to the work. My head ached. My ribs screamed when I tried to sit up. My jaw had swollen on the left side where Curtis Graves had hit me, and my lip was split at the corner. I catalogued these injuries the way my mother had taught me to catalog problems. Name them, assess them, decide what to do next. The door opened. The man who came through it was the one who had caught me. I was certain of that. He was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair that touched his collar, and the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and permanent. He moved carefully, like someone accustomed to not startling animals or people. He carried a cup of broth in one hand and a roll of clean bandaging in the other. He set the broth on the nightstand and stopped at a respectful distance from the bed. He said, "My name is Ryder Callahan. This is my ranch 3 miles outside Redemption Creek. You're safe here. I need to check your ribs if you'll allow it. I have some field medicine training." I said, "What do you want in return?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Nothing." I said, "Men who do things for nothing are either lying or simple, and you don't look simple." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of a point fairly made. He said, "I want you to drink the broth and let me check your ribs. After that, we can discuss the rest." I drank the broth. I let him check my ribs. He was efficient and careful, and he did not once step past what was necessary. And when he confirmed that 2 ribs were cracked and bound them in clean linen, he kept his eyes on the work and his hands on the task and nothing else. When he finished, he sat in the straight-back chair across the room. Not close, not hovering, simply present in the way of someone who understood that presence itself could be enough. I studied him the way I had learned to study everyone who might be either useful or dangerous. The way he sat with his back to the wall, the small flinch when the wind slammed the shutter, the old scar along his jaw that had not come from ranch work. I said, "You were a soldier." He said, "Yes." I said, "The man who hit me was Curtis Graves. He said he was collecting me for his brother Edmund. I'm supposed to be Edmund Graves's mail-order bride." Ryder Callahan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. He said, "I know who the Graves brothers are." I said, "Then you know I can't go to Edmund Graves." He said, "Yes." I said, "What do you suggest?" He looked at the fire for a long moment, then he looked back at me. He said, "Stay here until we figure out something better." I said, "And if I decide I don't want to stay?" He said, "Then I'll drive you to the county line myself, your choice of direction, but I won't drive you to Edmund Graves." That night, I lay in Ryder Callahan's spare room and listened to him move through the house below me until well past midnight, checking locks, feeding the fire, doing the quiet work of a man who does not sleep easily. I recognized that restlessness. I had spent 4 months with it myself since the Tuesday my parents died. I did not understand yet why hearing it in someone else made me feel less alone instead of more afraid. But it did. On the second morning, I woke before dawn and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the ranch come alive around me. Horses shifting in the barn, wind across the roof, the distant sound of an axe splitting wood, steady and rhythmic, before the light had fully come. My ribs were better with the binding. My jaw had gone from screaming to a deep, persistent ache. I was able to sit up without graying out, which I took as progress. I moved carefully to the small writing desk in the corner of the room. I want to be honest about what I was doing. I was searching. Not to steal, to understand. I had made the mistake once of trusting a man based on his letters alone, and I was not going to make that mistake again with the man whose house I was sleeping in. I found 3 things in the desk drawer. A stack of unopened letters from a law firm in Carson City. The return address marked Graves and Associates. There were 7 of them, the oldest dated 14 months ago, the newest just 3 weeks prior. None of them had been opened. A man who receives threatening legal correspondence for over a year and does not open it is either very calm or very certain he already knows what the letters say. A military discharge paper from the Army of the Potomac, dated mustering out in August of 1865. It listed commendations for field medicine under fire at Shiloh, Chickamauga, and the Wilderness. Whatever else Ryder Callahan was, he had been a good soldier who kept other men alive. The third thing was a small tin box, its lid worn smooth from being handled regularly over a long period. I opened it. Inside was a single button, roughly the size of a shirt button, painted blue. Nothing else, no note, no explanation, just the button, sitting in the bottom of the tin, worn smooth at the edges. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. The button stayed in my mind like a question I did not yet know how to ask. When Ryder came in from the morning work, his face was cold-reddened and his boots were wet with snow. He moved to the stove and put the coffee on without looking at me, and I sat at the kitchen table and waited. I said, "How long can I stay here before it becomes a problem?" He said, "It's already a problem. Edmund Graves is not a patient man." I said, "Then tell me the legal situation plainly. I'd rather know than not know." He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of me, and sat down across the table. He told me plainly. The mail order contract I had signed with the Westward Hearts Agency was a binding civil agreement under Nevada territorial law. Edmund had paid the agency fee and the travel costs, which created a debt obligation on my part. If I failed to fulfill the contract, Edmund could sue for breach, and the court, which in Redemption Creek meant Judge Clement Ward, would likely rule in his favor. I said, "Is the judge honest?" Ryder looked at his coffee cup. He said, "No." I said, "Is the sheriff?" He said, "Walter Briggs is honest enough." But honest enough and honest are different things when Edmund Graves is involved. I said, "So what are my options?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's one way to void a mail-order contract completely under territorial law. Marriage to someone else makes the original contract legally void. Edmund would have no standing to enforce it." I looked at him across the table. He looked back at me with the careful steadiness I was beginning to recognize as his default expression, the face of a man who has learned not to let what he is thinking show until he has decided it is safe to show it. I said, "Are you proposing to me, Mr. Callahan?" He said, "I'm describing a legal option." I almost smiled at that, almost. We talked through it for the better part of an hour. Not romantically. Not with any pretense that the situation was something other than what it was. Two people who had both been burned by trusting too easily, sitting across a kitchen table in a snowstorm, working out the terms of an arrangement that might protect us both. My conditions were three. First, a real marriage in function as well as name. I would cook, clean, manage the house, work the ranch where I was able, and be treated as an equal partner. I would not be a charity case living under someone else's roof. Second, within 2 weeks, he would tell me the full truth about whatever Edmund Graves was holding over him. Because something was being held. I had seen the unopened letters, and I had seen his face when I said Edmund's name. Third, if I decided to leave at any point, he would not prevent me. He agreed to the first without hesitation. He agreed to the third with a nod. His jaw tightened at the second, but he agreed. I said, "All right, Mr. Callahan, I'll marry you." He said, "Ryder." I said, "I'll marry you, Ryder." He said, "Clara." And then, after a pause, "I won't hurt you. I want you to know that. I understand if you don't believe it yet." I said, "I believe you think you mean it. That will have to do for now." He nodded once, like a man accepting the terms of a difficult negotiation, and got up to refill the coffee. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and relentless, covering the tracks of everything that had come before. The formal notice arrived from Edmund Graves on the third morning, carried by a rider who left it in the snow at the gate rather than approach the house. Ryder brought it in and read it at the table and handed it to me without comment. It said that Clara Mae Whitfield was contracted property under Nevada territorial law and must be delivered to the Graves Ranch within 48 hours or Ryder Callahan would face civil and criminal charges for interference and harboring. The word property sat in my chest like a coal. Ryder said, "We should go today." I said, "To the church?" He said, "To the church?" We drove into Redemption Creek in Ryder's supply wagon, through a morning that had cleared to pale, cold sunshine on fresh snow. The town was a single main street with a courthouse at one end and a church at the other, and everything necessary to human life arranged in between. It was the kind of town that notices things, and I felt the noticing as we drove down the center of it. Reverend Aldous Price was a man of perhaps 65, white-haired and gentle-eyed, with the look of someone who has spent decades listening to people and has long since stopped being surprised by anything they do. He welcomed us into the church and listened to the situation with his hands folded on the table and his expression carefully neutral. Then he asked Ryder to step outside. He asked me directly in a quiet voice whether I was doing this of my own free will. He looked at the healing bruise on my jaw when he asked it. I said, "Reverend Price, I have made decisions out of desperation before. This one I'm making with my eyes open. I understand the difference, and I would appreciate it if you did too." He studied me for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get my Bible." The ceremony was short and plain. Ryder and I stood before the Reverend with the church organist, a thin woman named Mrs. Barrett, as witness. There were no flowers, no guests, no music beyond what Mrs. Barrett could manage on short notice. Ryder repeated the vows in a steady voice, looking at me directly throughout. The way a man looks when he means what he is saying and wants to be sure it is received that way. When it was my turn, my voice was steadier than I expected. I, Clara May Whitfield, take you, Ryder Callahan, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Ryder took a small tin from his coat pocket. Inside was a silver ring, worn smooth with age, a small shamrock engraved on the inner band. He slid it onto my finger. I said, "Whose was it?" He said, "My mother's. She brought it from County Clare when she was 17. She kept it her whole life for something that mattered." I looked down at the worn silver on my hand and felt the weight of that. A woman I had never met, saving something precious across an ocean and a lifetime for exactly this kind of moment. When Reverend Price pronounced us husband and wife, he suggested Ryder might kiss his bride. Ryder looked at me with that careful steadiness. I stepped forward and pressed my lips briefly to his. His were warm and still in the cold church air, and he did not reach for me or pull me closer, simply received the gesture with the same serious attention he gave everything. Outside the church, Sheriff Walter Briggs was waiting. He was a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache and the eyes of someone who has seen too much to be easily surprised. He said, "I heard you two got married. Congratulations." He did not sound particularly celebratory. He said, "Edmund Graves is going to make considerable noise about this." Ryder said, "Let him." Briggs looked at the fading bruise on my jaw. He said, "Curtis do that?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's assault. I'll have a word with him." He paused. "I'm not saying Edmund is right about any of this. I'm saying be careful. Edmund has friends in places I can't always reach." He tipped his hat to me. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Mrs. Callahan. I'm sorry about your circumstances." We stopped at the general store for supplies before driving back to the ranch. The store was run by a woman named Dorothy Hargrove, who everyone called Dot. She was perhaps 55, Kentucky-born, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and the particular warmth of a woman who has rebuilt herself after loss and knows what that costs. She looked at me the way women look at other women when they are trying to decide something important. Then she handed me a sack of flour and said, "You need anything, you come here first. Not to the sheriff, not to the courthouse, here." I did not understand what she meant yet. I would. We drove back to the ranch in the pale winter afternoon. I sat beside Ryder on the wagon seat, and we did not speak much, but the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have agreed to something large and are both taking time to understand what they have agreed to. That evening, I cooked supper from what I found in his stores. Nothing fancy, just salt pork and beans and cornbread, but I made it the way my mother had taught me, with attention and care. Ryder ate 2 full plates and said it was the best meal he had eaten in months, and I could tell from his tone that he was not saying it to be kind. After supper, he washed the dishes without being asked, which surprised me. I dried them. We worked side by side in the small kitchen in a silence that was becoming, I realized, its own kind of conversation. He said, "The spare room is yours for as long as you want it." I said, "We agreed on a real marriage." He said, "We agreed you'd set the pace." I looked at him. He was looking at the dish in his hands with the focused attention of a man who is being very careful about something. I said, "That's fair. Thank you, Ryder." He nodded and put the dish away. I went upstairs and lay in the spare room and listened to him check the locks below. The silver ring on my finger caught the firelight from the small stove. I thought about his mother carrying it across an ocean. I thought about the blue button in the tin. I thought, I do not know this man, but I am beginning to think he might be worth knowing. The weeks that followed settled into a cautious rhythm. Ryder woke before dawn and worked until dark, tending cattle through the brutal January cold, breaking ice on the water troughs, repairing fencing that the storms had damaged. I cooked, cleaned, mended the considerable accumulation of neglected clothing I found in the wardrobe, and began planning a spring garden in the margins of an old almanac I found on the kitchen shelf. We ate together and talked carefully, about the ranch, about the cattle, about the weather. I learned that Ryder had come to Nevada in 1869, after years of drifting west from Virginia following the war. He had bought this land with 9 years of saved wages and built the house himself over 2 summers. He ran 40 head of cattle and 8 horses, and he had plans to expand the horse breeding operation if the coming year's finances allowed. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about Edmund Graves. I did not push. I had agreed to 2 weeks, and I intended to give him the full time. I began going into town with Ryder twice a week for supplies. I was drawn naturally to Dot Hargrove's general store, which smelled of dried herbs and pine resin and strong coffee, and where Dot herself could be relied upon to say exactly what she thought about any subject in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. We became friends the way women become friends in hard country, quickly, practically, with the understanding that friendship is a resource, and resources are not to be wasted. One Tuesday afternoon in late January, I stayed late at the store helping Dot reorganize her winter inventory while Ryder met with Deputy Aaron Holt at the courthouse across the street. Dot and I worked through the bolts of fabric in comfortable quiet, the lanterns burning gold against the early dark outside. Then a sound came from behind the locked door at the back of the store, a chair scraping against floorboards, a sharp, quickly suppressed breath. Dot went absolutely still. Her hands froze over a bolt of blue wool. I looked at the door. I looked at Dot. I waited. Dot set down the fabric. She reached into her apron pocket for a key. Her hands were not steady. She said, "I have kept this secret for 8 years. I kept it because I was afraid, and because I didn't know who to trust, and because the woman behind that door asked me to. She needs to meet you, Clara." She opened the door. The woman inside was sitting on a narrow cot with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight, the posture of someone maintaining dignity by an act of pure will. She was thin, pale, perhaps 38 years old. She had been beautiful once and was still striking with gray-green eyes that held the particular watchfulness of someone who has spent years listening for approaching footsteps. Dot said, "Clara Callahan, this is Margaret Ellis. She was Edmund Graves's first wife." I sat down on the only other chair in the room. Margaret Ellis told me her story in a flat, even voice, like a legal deposition. She had married Edmund in 1869, 2 months after his first wife died of what Edmund called a fever. She had been 29 years old and alone in the world, and Edmund's proposal had seemed like safety. She learned quickly that she had confused safety with captivity. Edmund controlled everything: the money, the movements, the conversations she was allowed to have. When she tried to resist, there were consequences. When she tried to leave, there were worse ones. In October of 1870, Edmund walked her to the edge of the North Cliff on the property on a Sunday afternoon. He told her it was a beautiful view. He was right about that much. Then he pushed her. She fell 15 feet before she caught a rock ledge. She hung there until she had the strength to climb down to a narrow shelf. She was there for 2 days before the snow covered her tracks, and she could move without being found. She walked 3 miles through the high desert in October cold, with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs. Dot found her in a ravine while gathering firewood, barely conscious, her arms set wrong, her lips blue with cold. Dot had put her in a cart and driven her home and hidden her in the back room of the general store, and she had been there ever since. I said, "Why didn't you go to the sheriff?" Maggie said, "Walter Briggs was new to the job then. Edmund had already had 2 private conversations with him about his first wife, setting the narrative. If I walked into the sheriff's office, Edmund would have been notified within the hour. I had seen what Edmund did to people who crossed him. I was not willing to find out what he would do to Dot." I looked at Dot. She had the expression of a woman who has made a decision she would make again and has never once been comfortable with the cost of it. I said to Maggie, "He picked me the same way he picked you. Women with no one left to come looking." Maggie looked at me directly for the first time. She said, "Yes, he has a very specific type. I recognized it the moment Dot told me you had arrived in town." I sat in that small room for a long time after that, thinking. I thought about the selection criteria Edmund must have used. I thought about 6 pleasant letters written in a controlled hand. I thought about a woman who had been hidden in a back room for 8 years because the man who was supposed to protect her had tried to kill her instead. I thought about what that meant for me. When I came back to the main room of the store, Dot was waiting with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking at me the way you look at someone when you have handed them a heavy thing and are waiting to see if they can hold it. I said, "Who else knows she's here?" Dot said, "No one, just you now." I said, "Then we need to keep it that way until we figure out how to use it." Dot blinked at me. I said, "Edmund Graves tried to murder his first wife, and she is alive and has been 12 miles from his front gate for 8 years. That is not a tragedy, Dot. That is evidence." I drove home through the dark with my hands steady on the reins and my mind working fast. Everything I had understood about Edmund Graves was now considerably more dangerous and considerably more useful. When I got back to the ranch, Ryder was at the gate, waiting despite the cold. He had noticed I was later than expected. He did not say so, but the set of his shoulders relaxed slightly when the wagon came into view. I did not tell him about Maggie that night. I needed to be sure first. Sure of Maggie, sure of the plan, and sure, if I was honest with myself, of Ryder. Edmund Graves made his first public move on a Thursday morning in early February. He called a town meeting at the Redemption Creek Courthouse, ostensibly to discuss water rights along the northern creek bed. Every ranching family in the county had a stake in water rights, so the room was full. Ranchers and their wives, merchants, Reverend Price, the school teacher, children sitting on their mothers' laps, and the full complement of townspeople who understood that an Edmund Graves town meeting was never actually about what it claimed to be about. Ryder and I arrived together. I had been in Redemption Creek for 3 weeks by then, long enough for people to have formed opinions about us, which I could feel in the room when we entered. Some nodded, some looked away. Some looked at my jaw, which had healed to yellow-green, and their expressions said things their mouths were too careful to. We stood near the back wall. Ryder preferred walls at his back in crowded rooms. I had noticed this and filed it without comment. Edmund Graves stood at the front of the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once doubted that the room belongs to him. He was taller than I had imagined from his letters, with silver hair and a controlled, handsome face, the face of a man who has learned that composure itself is a form of power. He spoke about water rights for exactly 4 minutes. Then he paused. He looked directly at Ryder. He said, "Before we conclude, I want to address a matter of community concern. Some of you know that a young woman named Clara Whitfield recently arrived in Redemption Creek under a legal contract of marriage to myself. You will also know that she is currently residing at the Callahan Ranch, and that a marriage ceremony was performed last week under what I would describe as coercive circumstances." The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Edmund said, "I won't speak today about that legal matter, which will be resolved in its proper venue. What I will speak about is the character of the man who has interfered in a legitimate civil agreement, because the people of Redemption Creek deserve to know who they are dealing with." He looked at Ryder again. His expression was perfectly controlled. He said, "In the spring of 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh, a soldier in the Army of the Potomac shot and killed a 14-year-old boy named Thomas James Aldred from Hardin County, Tennessee. Thomas Aldred was not a Confederate soldier. He was a farm boy who had seen Confederate troops moving through the woods and had run to warn the Union line. He was running toward the soldiers when he was shot." Edmund paused for effect. The room had gone absolutely still. He said, "That soldier was Ryder Callahan. I was his commanding officer. I covered the incident out of what I then believed was Christian mercy toward a young man who had acted in the chaos of battle. I have come to regret that mercy, because that young man has spent the years since using my protection as license to act however he pleases, without consequence." He sat down. I felt Ryder go very still beside me. Not the stillness of innocence, but the stillness of a man who has been dreading a specific moment for a long time and has just arrived at it. I did not take his arm. I did not step away. I stood exactly where I was. Ryder did not speak. He did not deny it. He looked at the front of the room with his jaw set hard and his face absolutely blank, and he said nothing, which in that room at that moment read like guilt. Edmund smiled. A small, controlled smile. the smile of a man who has just played a card he has been holding for 16 years. We rode home in silence for 4 miles. The cold was sharp, and the road was empty, and the horse's breath came in white clouds against the pale afternoon. At the door I said, "I need to know if it's true." Ryder said, "Yes." I said, "I need your version, not Edmund's." He said, "Not tonight, Clara." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Then I'll sleep in the spare room until you're ready. I'm not leaving, but I'm not pretending I didn't hear what I heard." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the spare bed and thought for a long time about what Edmund had said, and what it meant, and what kind of man keeps a dead boy's button in a tin for 16 years. A guilty man might do that. A man destroyed by guilt might do that. But a guilty man does not usually spend 16 years letting someone use that guilt as a leash. A guilty man, in my experience, finds a way to make the guilt stop. He buries it, or he drinks it down, or he runs from it entirely. A man who carries a button and keeps the letters unopened and still gets up before dawn every morning to break ice and tend cattle is a different kind of man. He is a man who has decided that the carrying is the only honest response to the thing he carries. I did not know yet if I was right, but I intended to find out before I decided anything else. Deputy Aaron Holt arrived at the Callahan Ranch on a Thursday morning before sunrise, riding in from the tree line rather than the road. He left his horse in the pines and came to the back door. He carried a leather satchel. He was 29, dark-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who has been watching the wrong things for too long and is trying to correct course. He had been a deputy in Redemption Creek for 4 years, and according to Dot, he was the only law in the county who had not been bought or frightened into Edmund Graves's orbit. Ryder let him in without surprise. I gathered from the ease between them that this was not the first quiet conversation they had had. Aaron spread the contents of his satchel on the kitchen table. Several documents, some official, some handwritten, all of them extracted from Edmund Graves's private office files over the past 3 weeks, in an operation Aaron described simply as careful. The mail order contract was on top, my signature at the bottom, next to Edmund's. Aaron laid a second document beside it, a letter written in a different hand than the contract. He said, "Look at the signatures." I looked. The contract signature and the letter signature did not match. Both were supposed to be Edmund Graves. They were not written by the same person. Aaron said, "The contract was signed by Curtis. He has a practiced forgery of his brother's name. I've seen him use it before on smaller things." I said, "So Edmund didn't send for me at all?" Aaron hesitated. He laid a third document on the table. It was a letter, written in the precise, controlled hand I recognized from the 6 letters I had received through the Westward Hearts Agency. This one was addressed to Curtis. It outlined selection criteria for a candidate. The criteria were no living immediate family, no financial resources or legal representation, willing to relocate permanently and without forwarding address, age between 20 and 30. At the bottom, in Edmund's hand, a single line. "She must be the kind of woman who disappears without questions." I read it twice, once for comprehension, once to be certain I was reading what I was reading. I said, "He didn't want a bride." Aaron said, "No." I said, "He needed a woman no one would look for." Aaron said, "Yes." I said, "Ma, to sign documents." Aaron said, "We believe so. Edmund has been trying to clear legal title to several land parcels that are still contested from his previous wives' estates. The documentation requires a living wife's signature in certain places. He needed someone who would sign without asking too many questions, and then could be made to go away quietly." Made to go away. I thought about Maggie Ellis in the back room of Dot's General Store. I thought about Helen Graves at the bottom of a cliff. I said, "He picked the wrong woman." The quality of my voice when I said it made both Ryder and Aaron look at me. Then I told them about Maggie Ellis. Aaron's expression went through several stages: disbelief, rapid recalculation, and then the particular look of a man whose long-held suspicion has just been confirmed by evidence he had stopped expecting to find. He said, "She's been in Dot's store this whole time." I said, 8 years. Aaron said, Edmund's going to know she's been found eventually. Once he realizes you're not going to break, he'll change tactics. Ryder said, how long do we have? Aaron said, not long. He's already filing paperwork with Judge Ward. He wants you in court inside of 3 weeks. Ryder looked at me. I looked back at him. I said, then we need to be ready before then. After Aaron left, Ryder and I sat at the kitchen table with the documents between us. The fire was burning low. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the pines with a sound like water. Ryder said, you've known about Maggie since Chapter 4. I said, since the Tuesday I stayed late at Dot's store. Yes. He said, why didn't you tell me? I said, I needed to be sure I could trust you with it first. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has lost an argument he is not entirely sorry to have lost. I said, I'm sure now, Ryder. Tell me about Shiloh. He looked at the table for a long time, then he looked up. He said, tonight, after supper, all of it. I came downstairs at 2 in the morning and found Ryder sitting by a fire that had burned nearly to nothing. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He had not heard me on the stairs. I stood at the bottom and watched his shoulders move with a single breath that came out ragged and controlled itself immediately. And then his shoulders went square again, and he was composed once more. Except that I had seen it. I crossed the room and sat beside him on the hearthstone. I put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't look up, but his hand moved in the dark and found mine. We stayed like that for a while. Then he said, the fog at Shiloh on the second night was absolute. A man could not see his own hand at arm's length. The Confederate flanking movement came at 3 in the morning. My unit was overrun on the left. A shape came running across the clearing toward our position, and I fired. 16 months of war had trained my hands to respond before my mind could ask questions. He stopped, started again. He said, Thomas James Aldred was 14 years old. He had seen the Confederate troops moving through the woods near his family's farm, and he had run to warn the Union line. He was running toward us when I shot him. His hands were clasped together between his knees, very still. He said, Edmund was my commanding officer. He covered it up, not because he was merciful, but because an inquiry would have exposed the positioning errors that left my unit exposed in the first place. Those errors were his, so he buried the report and handed me a debt instead. He has been collecting on it ever since. He said, the button was from Thomas's coat. I have carried it since the morning after the battle, not as punishment, as memory, as a promise to myself that I would not forget what it costs to fire before you ask. He went quiet. I said, did you mean to kill him? Ryder said no. I said, then you have been paying Edmund Graves for an accident for 16 years. He said nothing. I said, that ends now. I felt him turn to look at me in the dark. I said, we have Maggie, we have Aaron's documents, we have you, and you have a story that makes Edmund's version of events look exactly like what it is, which is a lie told by a man protecting himself. We are going to end this, Ryder, all of it, but I need you to be willing. He said, I've been afraid of what ending it would cost. I said, I know, but not ending it has a cost too, and we've both been paying it long enough. The fire was almost gone. I got up and put 2 more logs on it and watched the flames come back up. And when I turned around, Ryder was watching me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Open somehow, unguarded. He said, my mother used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is decide to keep going when they have very good reasons to stop. I said, she sounds like she was a wise woman. He said, she was. I sat back down beside him. We stayed by the fire until it was burning properly again, and neither of us said much more. But the silence had changed into something else, something that did not need words to mean what it meant. The next morning, Aaron came early with one more piece of the story. He sat across the table and said he had something to confess. He had spent 3 years as Edmund's paid deputy. Edmund had cleared his father's gambling debts in exchange for Aaron's badge and his silence. He had told himself it was temporary. He had told himself he was managing the situation. Then in March of 1873, he watched Edmund walk his second wife, Helen Graves, to the North Cliff on a Sunday afternoon. He watched Edmund crouch at the edge of the path and work something into the rock face with his hands. He did not understand what he was watching. 3 days later, Helen Graves fell from that cliff and died. Aaron went to investigate before the body was moved. He found oil worked into the rock in the exact place a boot would plant for balance. Edmund was standing at the cliff base when Aaron arrived. He looked at Aaron across the crime scene and smiled. Aaron said, "He didn't say anything. He didn't have to." The smile said, "We both know what happened here, and we both know what happens to people who talk about it." He said he had been building a case since that afternoon. He had always known his testimony alone would not be enough. He needed something bigger. I said, "Maggie Ellis is bigger." Aaron said, "Yes." The 3 weeks after that had a different quality. The danger was still there, circling at the edges of everything we did, but something had shifted at the center of it. Ryder and I moved through the days with the ease of people who have stopped pretending they don't need each other. I moved my things into his room quietly on a Sunday morning while he was out with the horses. When he came in for dinner and saw that the spare room door was standing open, he looked at me across the kitchen and I looked back at him and neither of us said anything about it. That evening he laughed at something I said about the chickens. A real laugh, startled out of him, filling the kitchen like something that had been absent from it for a very long time. I thought, this is it. This is the thing I came west for. I should have been paying more attention to the shadows at the edges of it. But happiness has a way of narrowing your vision to exactly the size of the good thing in front of you. Edmund moved on a Tuesday. The arrest warrant was signed before breakfast. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Callahan Ranch at midday, coming up the road in a line of 3, their badges catching the thin winter sun. Ryder saw them from the far pasture and walked to meet them across the frozen yard without running. I watched from the porch with my hands gripping the rail. Before they put the handcuffs on, Ryder crossed the yard to me. He stood close and spoke quietly so only I could hear. He said, "Don't go to Edmund. Whatever he offers, whatever he threatens, promise me." I said, "I promise." They led him away. I stood in the snow until the sound of hoofbeats disappeared completely. Then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and began to think. The charges were civil interference, harboring a person in breach of obligation, and a false statement claiming Ryder had threatened Edmund's life. Judge Clement Ward had signed the warrant. The trial was set for Friday morning. It was currently Tuesday afternoon. I had 3 days. I got up to put the kettle on. And then I knew. I had known for 2 weeks in the way your body knows things before your mind is willing to name them. The particular exhaustion. The way certain smells had become unbearable. The morning nausea that arrived at exactly 7 o'clock and departed by 9. I was pregnant. I sat back down at the table. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, turning it over, understanding what it meant for everything I was about to do. Edmund's message arrived by nightfall, delivered by a boy of about 12 who handed me the paper at the door and ran immediately without waiting for a response. The message was brief. It said, "Deliver Margaret Ellis to my property by tomorrow evening. Do so, and all charges against your husband will be dismissed. You have my word that you and Ryder Callahan may leave Redemption Creek permanently without further interference. If you do not, he will stand before Judge Ward on Friday." I read it once, folded it, set it on the table. Edmund knew Maggie was alive. He had known or suspected long enough to have planned for it. He was using Ryder to force me to do what he could not do himself. Find Maggie and bring her out into the open. Dot was being watched. Aaron could not move openly without alerting Edmund's men. The attorney Aaron had contacted from Carson City would not arrive until Friday at the earliest. I had no one left but myself. I wrote in my journal that night. I wrote, "I have been underestimated my entire life. By the bank, by the boarding house on Clement Street. By Edmund Graves, who looked at my file and saw a woman with nothing and no one, and believed that made her nothing. He was wrong about what nothing means. Nothing means you have already survived losing everything and kept moving. It means you know exactly how much weight you can carry, and it turns out you can carry considerably more than anyone expected. I put on my warmest coat. I checked the load on the rifle Ryder had taught me to use on the first clear morning after the storm, when he had said with characteristic economy that a woman alone on a Nevada ranch needed to know how to do this. I picked up the lantern. I walked out into the dark toward Dot's store. Not to betray Maggie, to ask her something. Dot let me in through the back without a word, her face tight with worry. I went through to the back room and sat across from Maggie Ellis in the narrow lamplight. And I told her everything. The documents Aaron had found, Edmund's ultimatum, Ryder in a jail cell, the trial on Friday. Then I told her about Shiloh, about a blue button in a tin box, and what it costs a person to carry someone else's ghost when you can't figure out how to put it down. I told her about the selection criteria document with its cold, specific language, no living family, no one to come looking, and I told her that after me there would be someone else. Edmund would find another woman who fit the description, and she would not have a Ryder Callahan to catch her. Maggie was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered between us. She said, "I've been surviving for 8 years, but I stopped living a long time ago." I said, "Then come back." She looked at me across the small table. Her hands were trembling slightly in her lap. Her spine was very straight. She said, "If I walk into that courtroom and Edmund sees me—" I said, "He'll know it's over. That's exactly why it has to be you." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind moved through Redemption Creek, down the empty main street, past the courthouse where Clement Ward was probably already sharpening his pen. Maggie said, "Tell me the plan." The plan was this. I would go to Edmund's estate alone and keep him occupied. Aaron would take Maggie by the back road through the Eastern Pass, in Dot's covered supply wagon, to the county courthouse in Mill Haven, 12 miles east, where State Circuit Judge George Prescott was scheduled to be in session for unrelated land disputes. Dot's evidence strongbox, locked behind the back wall for 8 years, contained Edmund's handwritten order instructing Curtis to ensure that Margaret did not survive the fall from the North Cliff. Maggie's journal, 140 pages, documenting 18 months of abuse with dates, incidents, and witness names, and a hand-drawn map marking where Helen Graves was actually buried 3 miles east of the cliff, in a grave Edmund had dug himself the night she died. The signal to me that Maggie had arrived safely, a red bandana tied to the fence post at the crossroads between Edmund's estate and Mill Haven. I rode to Edmund's estate in the cold Friday dawn, alone. His study was everything I had expected: dark wood, controlled order, the room of a man who believes that his environment reflects his character. He received me without surprise. He had been expecting either compliance or confrontation, and he was prepared for both. He was utterly calm. He spoke to me as if I were already defeated, and we were completing a formality. He offered the arrangement once more, his voice pleasant, his hands folded on the desk. Signed 3 documents confirming I had never encountered Margaret Ellis. Ryder would walk free. He would provide traveling funds. He framed it as generosity. I sat across from him and asked careful questions. About the town, about the ranch, about his time in Nevada. I asked about his wives, phrased delicately, as a woman trying to understand the man she might need to deal with. Edmund enjoyed talking about himself. It was, I had come to understand, his only real vanity, the certainty that his own thinking was worth explaining at length to anyone willing to listen. I kept him talking for 2 hours and 7 minutes. Then I said I needed to step outside for a moment. He nodded, gracious, certain of the outcome. I walked to the end of his drive. The fence post at the crossroads was visible from there, 300 yards distant. There was a red bandana tied to it. I got back on my horse and rode for Mill Haven. Judge George Prescott had called the Friday session to order at 9 in the morning. The room was fuller than anyone had expected for a land dispute hearing. Word travels fast in small territories, and the word that had traveled was that something was happening in Mill Haven today that was worth seeing. Ryder stood at the defense table in borrowed clothes, his attorney, a young man named Henry Walsh, whom Aaron had reached by telegraph in Carson City, making careful arguments to a bench that was not listening. Ward had decided. The paperwork was on the table. At 10 minutes past 9, the courthouse door opened. Margaret Ellis walked in. She was thin. She was pale. She had not stood in a public room in 8 years. Her hands were shaking at her sides, and she knew it. And she walked anyway. She walked to the front of the room with her chin level and her spine straight, and she placed 3 items on the clerk's table. The room was absolutely silent. Edmund's handwritten order for her death. Her journal, 140 pages, witness names included. The map. Judge Ward looked at the items on the table. He looked at the room full of Redemption Creek citizens who had traveled 12 miles on a cold Friday morning. People who had been afraid of Edmund Graves for 15 years and were still afraid and had come anyway. He removed his glasses, set them down. He said, "The charges against Ryder Callahan are dismissed in their entirety." He called for the bailiff. He asked Aaron Holt, standing at the back of the room in his official capacity for once, to send riders to Edmund Graves's property immediately. I came through the courthouse door just as Ryder was walking out. He crossed the distance between us without slowing. He held me without speaking. I could feel his heart hammering through his coat. After a long moment, I said, my voice muffled against his chest, "I have something to tell you." He pulled back to look at my face. I said, "We're going to need to build another room onto the house." He went very still. Understanding moved across his face, quiet and total and luminous, like the first light coming over a ridge line. He picked me up carefully and turned a slow circle in the Millhaven courthouse snow. He laughed, the same laugh I had heard once in our kitchen, except larger now, filling the cold Nevada air. Edmund Graves was arrested at his own front gate that afternoon. He did not resist. He looked like a man who had run out of moves and had known for some time that he was running out. Curtis Graves was caught 2 days later by a United States Marshal outside Reno. His horse lame in the high desert, nowhere left to run. The trial in Carson City took 6 days. Edmund Graves was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, extortion, and the premeditated murder of Helen Graves. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nevada State Penitentiary. He died there 4 years later, still speaking to the guards in the measured tone of a man who has not accepted that the room no longer belongs to him. Curtis served 12 years and drifted into obscurity in the Arizona Territory, a diminished man. Judge Clement Ward resigned in exchange for reduced charges and left Nevada permanently. Aaron Holt was appointed sheriff of Redemption Creek by unanimous vote, the first unanimous vote on anything in the town's recorded history. He held the position with integrity for the next 11 years. Margaret Ellis spent 3 months learning to exist in daylight again. Then she took a permanent stake in Dot's General Store and was behind the counter herself by spring, talking to customers, occasionally laughing at something one of the ranch children said. She never remarried. She said when I asked her about it that she would like to belong entirely to herself for a while. It suited her in every way I could see. In April, Ryder sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Tennessee. He had found Ruth Aldred Morrison through careful inquiry, Thomas's younger sister, now 31, married with 3 children, farming the same land her father had farmed in Hardin County. He wrote 2 pages in his careful hand, telling her the full truth about Shiloh without embellishment or excuse. He told her about the fog and the ambush and the shape running across the clearing. He told her about the button. He asked whether she would like it returned. Her reply came in late July. 1 page. She said her brother had indeed seen the Confederate troops and run to warn the Union soldiers. She had always known this. She said her brother was brave, and that the fog and the dark and the terrible speed of war were not things she held against any soldier who survived that night. She said, "Keep the button. My brother was a boy who ran toward danger to help people he did not know. The fact that you have carried him this long tells me something about the kind of man you are." He would not have minded. Ryder read this letter on a Sunday morning in July while I watched from across the kitchen. When he looked up, something behind his eyes was different. Lighter, I thought. Like a window opened in a room that has been closed so long it had forgotten what air felt like. He put Ruth's letter in the tin beside the blue button, closed the lid, and carried the tin to the mantelpiece in the main room. He set it there where it could be seen. Not hidden. Remembered. I put my hand on his back and he covered it with his, and we stood in the Sunday morning light and did not need to say anything about it. Our son arrived in September, when the Nevada heat was finally breaking and the first cool mornings of autumn felt like a promise. The labor was long. Ryder wore a path in the kitchen floorboards. Aaron sat in the yard on an upturned bucket pretending he had official business in the area. Dot managed the domestic arrangements and kept everyone supplied with food they were too distracted to eat. When the baby cried for the first time, Ryder took the stairs in 3 steps. I was exhausted and more fully myself than I had ever looked. The baby had Ryder's dark hair, and even in the first minutes of his life, my exact expression of careful assessment, as though he was already determining whether the situation met his standards. Ryder held his son with the hands of a man who builds things to last. We named him Thomas James Callahan. Ryder did not explain the name to anyone who asked. I did not explain it either. Some things belong only to the people who understand them fully, and the understanding is part of what makes them matter. 5 years passed. Good years, difficult in the ordinary ways that good years are difficult, full of work and weather, and the small negotiations of 2 people building a life together in a place that asks a great deal of everyone who stays. Redemption. Creek changed. The new schoolhouse on the east end of Main Street was built with timber donated by 6 ranching families who had been afraid to donate anything while Edmund was alive. The courthouse had a new judge, appointed by the state, answerable to the state, unacquainted with the concept of being owned by anyone. The sign above Dot's store read, Hargrove and Ellis General Goods, painted blue and white by Maggie herself on a warm morning in April of 1880. The Callahan Ranch expanded. More horses, a proper barn with a hayloft, a kitchen garden I tended with the focused attention of a woman who spent too many years without anything that was entirely hers to grow. Ryder built a covered porch along the south side of the house so I could sit in the evenings without the wind off the bluffs. Thomas was 4 years old and had established that the 6 chickens in the yard were a suitable audience for his developing opinions on various subjects. He had his father's dark hair and my green eyes, and an air of absolute self-possession that made the ranch hands shake their heads and smile. I was expecting our second child in the spring. On a Thursday evening in January, exactly 5 years after a stagecoach lost a wheel on an icy bend outside of town, I stepped onto the south porch to call Thomas in from the yard. The boards were glazed with the afternoon freeze. My boot caught the edge of the top step. I started to fall. Ryder's hand closed around my arm before I could. He pulled me upright and against him, steady and immediate. And we stood together on the icy porch while Thomas shouted something instructive at the chickens in the yard below. Ryder looked down at me. 5 years of mornings and winters in one terrible January, and a courtroom and a letter from Tennessee, and a boy's name on a mantelpiece tin, and a child laughing in a Nevada yard, and a life built from nothing into something so solid I could feel it in the structure of every day. He was looking at me the way he had always looked at me when he thought I was not paying attention, like catching me was the best decision he had ever made, and he would make it again without a moment's hesitation, in any weather, on any road. I put my hand against his face. He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to my palm. The same gesture I had come to understand meant everything he did not always have the words for. He said quietly, "You all right?" I said, "I'm all right." He did not let go of my arm. The sun went down over Redemption Creek and turned the snow gold, and Thomas came running across the yard with cold pink cheeks and something urgent to report about the behavior of the hen nearest the gate. Ryder's arm came around my shoulders, warm and certain as everything he had built. I thought about a girl in a Columbus boarding house who had answered a stranger's letters because she had nothing left and nowhere to go. I thought about what she would say if she could see this yard, this porch, this man, this life. I thought she would say, "You were never going nowhere. You were always going here. You just did not know it yet." He had caught me the first time because it was the right thing to do. Every time after that, he caught me because he wanted to. There is a difference between those two things, and I spent 5 years being grateful for it every single morning. And I intended to spend the rest of my life doing the same. The stars came out over Nevada, sharp and bright and impossibly numerous, the way they only come out in true cold, when the air is clean enough to see all the way to the end of everything. Thomas ran up the porch steps and grabbed his father's hand and said something about supper, and Ryder said yes in a minute and looked down at me one more time. He said, "Come inside, Clara, you'll get cold." I said, "In a minute." I wanted to stay just a little longer with the stars and the cold and the gold light fading on the snow. I wanted to hold it, the way you hold things you know are precious, not tight enough to damage them, just close enough to feel the weight of them in your hands. This was what I had come west for. Not safety, not a contract, not survival. This exact moment, on this exact porch, with this exact man and this child and this life we had built from nothing into something real. I had been caught, not falling, but held. Finally, completely, and forever held. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
There is a moment near the beginning of this story that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of story it is. Clara Mae Whitfield falls from a stagecoach into a Nevada snowstorm, and a stranger catches her. Not because he knows her, not because he wants something from her, simply because she was falling, and he was there, and catching her was the right thing to do. That single gesture, a man choosing to reach out when he could have looked away, becomes the foundation of an entire life. This story is, on its surface, a tale of survival. A young woman with nothing left makes a desperate choice and lands in the hands of dangerous men. But underneath that drama, this is a story about something quieter and more difficult. The courage it takes to trust again after you have been betrayed. The courage it takes to stay present in your own life when every experience has taught you to protect yourself by feeling less. Clara and Ryder are mirror images of each other. Both have been wounded by the world's willingness to use people as instruments. Both have learned to keep their hands open and their expectations low. And both discover, slowly and carefully, that the very qualities that made them careful, their honesty, their refusal to pretend, their insistence on naming things as they are exactly what make them safe for each other. The moral of this story is not that love conquers all. It is more specific and more useful than that. It is this: the right person does not ask you to be smaller in order to be loved. Edmund Graves chose women specifically for their smallness. No family, no resources, no one to come looking. He needed people who had already been made nothing by the world, because nothing is easier to erase. Ryder Callahan chose differently. He chose a woman who looked him in the eye from a sickbed and said, "Men who do things for nothing are either lying or simple, and you don't look simple." He chose someone who pushed back, who set conditions, who told him, plainly, that his suffering did not make him a mystery. It made him a man who needed to put something down. And she chose a man who, when she was falling, reached out without thinking about what it would cost him. That is the love worth building a life around. Not the love that rescues you from yourself, but the love that stands beside you while you rescue yourself, and catches you on the icy porch 5 years later without even thinking twice. We are all, in some way, falling. The question is, who reaches out?